Okay, so it looks like we've started the recording. I'm going to go ahead and get this user group running. So this is the November session of the Valorum Databricks user group. I'm Spencer Cook. I'm a data scientist at Valorum Reply in the data-driven enterprise practice. I run this user group. I also do a couple of live development sessions a week, usually on Wednesdays at noon Central Time, all around Databricks. Also recently got my Databricks Solution Architect Champion badge, so I'm really excited about that. But I'm just excited to talk about Databricks with you guys today. I do want to call out, we've got Lindsay Rain in the chat. She's going to be moderating this session. So go ahead and give her an app mention if you have any questions. We've also got a pretty small group today, so I won't mind if you just unmute your mic and get my attention if you've got a question. I kind of want this to be an open discussion. But with that, let's dive in. So last week, kind of out of the blue, another unexpected conference announcement came out of Databricks, which is Sql Analytics. So Sql Analytics is sort of the capstone for the data lakehouse architecture that we've been talking about throughout the year. So just a reminder of what that looks like. You've probably seen me discuss this in a bunch of different sessions, but data lakehouses are this architecture you see here on the right, and it's this natural progression on the data warehouse and then data lake architecture that we've seen in data over the past few decades. So in traditional data warehouses, you have these structured relational data sources going through some sort of ETL engine into a data mart and then being consumed by BI and reporting resources doing analytics. With the data lake, you're able to integrate those structured data sources along with semi-structured and unstructured data sources, store them on a data lake. You need these additional mechanisms for data prep and validation because a data lake is, by its very nature, sort of an unverified source. It's easy to turn into a data swamp, even. And then you're still feeding either in through real-time systems like Kafka or going through data marts and still serving these same endpoint use cases. You can also facilitate data science and ML more easily. The Lakehouse aims to bring both of those together. So essentially what you're seeing is this layer and this layer being pushed down into the data lake layer. So in all of our cases, we're talking about cloud-based data lakes. You can, run a Hadoop file system locally, but that's sort of outside the focus of, modern analytics in my mind, at least for the tasks I work on. So think about this as just being compute and storage on the cloud coupled into one resource. And then your different work lanes for BI, streaming analytics, data science, and ML are all able to consume off of this unified analytics platform. Now, one of the cool things that got announced at the summer conference was Delta Engine. And so if you look here, so Delta Engine is essentially just a optimization tool. So this piece right here is really what this layer is. So it feeds your SQL queries, your data frame APIs queries, and also your Pandas koala queries, all through a query optimizer layer, a native execution engine, which is sort of a bare metal um, uh, compute repurposing engine. So like they restructured, for instance, the way that like vectors are stored actually at the CPU level. And then caching is at the storage level. So all these optimizations sit on top of Delta Lake and your Lakehouse architecture to facilitate these different ones. So what we're going to be talking about today with SQL Analytics is essentially the component that sits on top of that. Like how do we interface with the Delta engine in a way that doesn't require people to be perfectly literate and Spark and know how to partition everything correctly and manage their data frame code. This is also a extension of what we saw with the Redash announcement. So you'll see throughout these screenshots that this is sort of this net new card or interface or workflow within Databricks. So that's SQL Analytics. So um, the goal is to provide a SQL native interface on top of data. So when you click on this little grid of icons down here, similar to the grid that you'd see in like the Office portal, for instance, you're going to see the traditional Databricks Workspace, which is what you've seen me demo in my live streams, and we've done in demos here. You're also going to see SQL Analytics now. And when you go into it, you're going to get an interface that's very similar to what you would see from the Synapse Studio API, from SQL Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, a lot of SQL native tools. And that's, no coincidence. The goal here is to make it easier for engineers, analysts, and data scientists that are more familiar and literate in a SQL native world working on top of Databricks. So you're going to be able to write fully featured SQL native queries that just happen to point to your Delta or your data lakehouse instead and use those. You're also, and this is for Redash, you're also going to be able to use dashboarding features that you've seen coming from other interfaces all built in. So for instance, this query could generate a set of data that then gets turned into a map for average customer. And these dashboards are able to be pinned and shared, automatically refreshed, very similar to what we'd expect from Databricks at this point. But you can already see that this is like kind of a distinct way. I think this really makes it clear why Dash acquisition was such a big deal. I didn't necessarily see myself using it just, but they've taken this whole interface wholesale from Dash, and I think it works really. Another big benefit of this is the price to performance ratio. So we can see that it can be up to 9 times better price to performance than competing data warehouse engines. And a lot of that comes from the Delta engine. So being able to efficiently run queries on top of your Delta Lake makes it so that you aren't wasting time on compute. Caching makes it so that you aren't wasting time on storage. It's all very efficient and high throughput. You also get similar to concurrency to what we've been seeing from Azure Synapse. So overall, it's very competitive. You're also going to get the data lake administration features that you're used to with Databricks, obviously. In a lot of Valorem's use cases, this is through ADLS, which is best in class, and Databricks isn't reinventing the wheel there. It's really just taking those existing tool sets and making them compatible with what's happening in both Databricks and now in SQL Analytics. And similar with reliability, any cloud you build it on top of, you're obviously going to want to trust, right? Like whether it be Azure, AWS, any other Databricks vendor. But because of the specific semantics of Delta Lake, which we've talked about in previous sessions, you know that you're going to get guaranteed ACID transactions. You know that you're going to get good semantics for aborting and retrying jobs. You're going to be able to audit your data pipelines, et cetera. And since Data Lake also has, or Delta Lake rather, also has time travel, you can do transaction rollbacks. It really is an advanced data governance and reliability platform as well. And of course, just like any other Databricks tool, you still get multi-cloud support. So this is all pretty cool. One of the things I want to do here, so this is high level. I want to kind of go in circles, go a little bit deeper, then do another lap a little bit deeper. So let's talk about what is Azure Databricks SQL Analytics. So a couple of the features, and by the way, this is the new Azure doc set that dropped earlier this week. So I'll be sharing links to all this in the chat. But one of the one of the things that's different from a marketing perspective versus a user's perspective is what you can do with it, right? Like, how are you going to interface with this? And so from a engineer or user perspective, it's a little bit more simple. So you get fully managed SQL endpoints in the cloud. And we'll dive into these in a little bit, but essentially this allows you, in the same way you would deploy, say, a cluster previously and have Power BI connect to it or have a user query data from it. Having a SQL endpoint in the cloud just gives you a managed SQL path that someone can query from with a certain level of latency, certain amount of concurrency, and it gets the dynamic sizing and cost management that is standard on clusters. So pretty similar there. The dashboards we already saw an example of is just a way of combining visualizations and text. The difference between this and the dashboards that you've had in your traditional Databricks workspace is twofold. So first, they're a little bit richer because it's using the full redash experience. So we'll show a couple examples of how to build a dashboard from this set of documentation. And you'll see that it's a little bit more robust than what you get just in the traditional Databricks workspace. That makes it slightly higher learning curve, but I think it's worthwhile. The other thing that you get that's a little bit different is this is all backed by SQL code. So you're no longer needing to write code in one of the four Spark APIs and then turn that into your dashboard. You can, lift straight ANSI SQL and use that to support all of these dashboards. You also get an alerts dashboard. So far, all of these are just tabs. Your alert tab essentially lets you see when a query hits a certain threshold or when a certain action happens on the back end. So if you think about this in conjunction with something like the Power Platform, you could have it say when like our sales exceed 1,000 units in a certain hour, it could go ahead and kick off a chain of automation to alert a business user. It could kick off a refresh for an ad hoc Power BI report. Really anything that you can think of as far as those automation tie-ins is going to be available through here. And I think that's going to be something I use quite a bit personally. And then finally, in your security layer, you get similar Azure Active Directory integration like we've talked about, RBAC roles, SLAs, et cetera. The thing that I think is going to be really cool is getting role-based access directly into the SQL management part of the tool. So previously, what this has looked like is you going into, for instance, Azure, right? And you're saying this person is allowed to get to this particular portion of my storage account, right? Similar with S3, whatever else. The difference here is that you're handling it in the same way that you might on SQL Server. So those same semantics you had around user management and data governance on SQL Server, you're now going to be able to bring to Databricks, and you're not going to necessarily need to be fully Azure literate to make this available. And I think that's going to work a lot better as it scales out. You have, instead of just dozens of users, potentially hundreds of thousands of users consuming from any given. Then finally, you get integration with Microsoft. So you get integration with Synapse, you get Cosmos, Power BI, everything. So I think there's a lot here. There was a really good write-up of this that I want to dive into as well. So let's go ahead first, though, and look at what's available in this documentation. So I'm going to, again, post a link to this in chat, but you'll notice this is just a new sub tab within the Azure documentation. So similar to how they talk.
Hey, Spencer, is he cutting out for any of you guys, or is it just me? He's cutting out for me too.
Okay. It's just a little choppy. I don't know if there's anything that you can do to improve that.
Yeah, I'm hardwired on fiber. My microphone is plugged directly in. I think it very well might just be a Teams issue. Let me see if.
You're sounding good now.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll keep going. Just let me know if I need to repeat anything, please. And I'm going to go ahead and free up some RAM just in case it's that. Okay. Just let me know. Thank you. Okay. So as I was saying, this Azure Hub has had an Azure Databricks Hub for quite a while. Underneath the overview, you see that now there's, in addition to Databricks and the Databricks Workspace, there's also Databricks Sql Analytics, because again, this is a wholly parallel tool. So if you jump into this Azure Databricks SQL Analytics main hub, you'll see that there's the SQL Analytics documentation. This is what we're going to be jumping around for the rest of the session. This got released late last week, and I can't express just how valuable it's been so far. They have how-to guides and references for just about everything related to the tool. So until I'm able to get access to the public preview, this is where I'm going to be doing most of my reading and research to understand how to use this tool and what it's going to be valuable for. So one of the other things that Microsoft released was this discussion about some SQL Analytics concepts. So the key thing for any tool is understanding how to use it where everything lives. I know that like every time there's a new Power BI interface change, that's one of the main things we hear back from users is, like basically the who moved my cheese kind of stuff, figuring out where to go to get to Power Query and things like that. So let's just walk through some of the assets here, some of the user interface components. So similar to on Databricks, everything's going to be tabs on the left. So you've got dashboards, queries, endpoints, history, and alerts. History is going to be the same as in the Databricks workspace. Everything else is essentially net new to SQL Analytics. The other thing worth calling out is this REST API. So we'll dig into that a little bit later, but similar to how Databricks is fully manageable through their CLI, SQL Analytics is going to have a REST API. So if you want to manage your SQL Analytics endpoints through, say, for instance, PowerShell, or see your query history, whatever you might want to do, it's all available through this API, and it's pretty robust. For data management, you're able to work with SQL endpoints, connections to external data sources, visualizations, and dashboards. Visualizations are a subcomponent of a dashboard, and your alerts. For computation, we have queries and query history. A query, think of it like a cell in a Databricks Workspace notebook. It's just SQL specific. So it's any valid SQL statement. And then your query history is just a robust list of executed queries and what their performance characteristics are. So if something, for instance, was performing poorly or performing well, this is where you could verify that. And then as far as authentication and authorization, you have users and groups, similar to what you see in Databricks. You also have personal access tokens. So these are what you can use to authenticate your REST API. It's also what you use to authenticate your SQL endpoints when you connect to BI tools. So if you've done the Databricks connector or the Spark connector in the past with Power BI, you probably used a personal access token to connect. Recently, they've added support for Azure Active Directory pass-through. I would expect the same thing here for the SQL endpoints. I believe for now, though, it's all going to be token-based access. And then finally, your access control list. That's essentially just a JSON list of permissions that's attached to any principal that requires an object. So an ACL just lets you say this object is allowed to do this, this, and this from this entity. And so we'll talk about those a little bit more specifically too, but that's essentially how you handle security within this new environment. So another another thing that came out actually just yesterday night was this nice write-up from Mike Cornell at Microsoft. I don't know if you guys follow this tech community site, but it's got several great blogs, and Mike does a lot of really good stuff around Azure Databricks and specifics. And he broke out some of the key features of SQL Analytics. And one of the cool things is it has rich links to the Databricks documentation that we were just looking at. So I want to walk through this and look at some of the specific tasks that he's talking about in the specific documentation. But when I link this, keep in mind that this is a really nice little compendium of what's available in that documentation versus just going through it linearly. Okay, so one of the things that he calls out here that's really nice is this visual. Note, it's basically what we're looking at here, except it's well labeled. So when we look at a diagram like this, I tend to start at the bottom left with our storage account or our data lake. So in this case, what we're looking at is a SQL storage account that is Delta Lake enabled. So essentially this has data stored on it that has been made available through Delta. So you have your standard bronze, silver, and gold zones. We talked about those in specific in both our Delta Lake discussion, and also I've been going through it in my weekly development sessions. So just a reminder, if you haven't seen those, bronze is always going to be your raw zone or history zone. Silver is where you have your filtered, cleaned, and augmented data. And then gold is where you do your business logic. So these curated data stores that are Delta enabled are all sitting in a ADLS Gen 2 storage account. And what we're doing with SQL Analytics is we're using Delta Engine to query from them. So there's a couple key components here. So your SQL editor, your query catalog, your dashboarding, your BI connections, integrated security, and your faster compute are all enabled through the Delta engine. And what they all facilitate are these SQL BI and reporting tools. So whether it be Power BI, Azure Synapse, or Data Explorer, or Kusto, you're able to do either queries directly through the SQL endpoints on SQL Analytics on Databricks, or do rich ad hoc queries directly off your storage account through Delta Lake. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So we've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to go ahead and dive deeper into the query editor now. So again, this is something that should be very familiar to you if you've used notebooks like Azure Notebooks, or if you've used the notebook experience in Databricks. But ideally, it's pretty familiar to you as well if you've used SQL Server. So let's go ahead and crack this open. So remember, one of the new things that we have is a button on the left for queries. So if you click that, and then click New Query, you're going to get this query editor window. And so what you can do is connect to an endpoint or an external data source. Now, one of the things I want to talk about next is how to make an endpoint, right? But presumably your IT team or your data engineering team have already scoped all of that out, and you're just an analyst who wants to munch some data, right? So you can go ahead and crack this open, and then you can see, similar to a Databricks cluster, whether your endpoint is already running and available, whether it's in the process of starting, or whether it's stopped. If it's stopped, you're going to need to start it to query from it. But then once it's ready to go, this is what's going to facilitate your connection to the Delta Lake. So once it's ready, you should be able to get a drop down and pick a database to read from. So if we look back at this screenshot, you can see that we're reading from, I think they've got it covered actually. Sorry, never mind, it's right there. So this drop down will show you that you're reading from the loans table here, right? And so if you have sufficient permissions to read from that database, you'll be able to also see the schema and available tables within it right there. So once you filter down to the schema you want, you can click on a table and see its columns. And then if you double click on it or hold this down, then you'll be able to insert that item into your query, and then it's just a matter of executing it. So here, this looks very similar to what you'd see from something like SSMS or Data Studio. And so when we execute it, we can limit it to the top 1,000, similar to what we get in the Databricks workspace. And then we go ahead and run. Now, once we get the results, this is where you start to get into some of the more interesting components. So we can set up an automatically scheduled refresh of a query. You can also manually refresh, obviously, by clicking refresh. But then some of the cool tools that they've enabled here are the ability to save to your queries list. This is new, not available in the Databricks workspace. And you can also publish a query. Publishing it is what makes it available in a dashboard and an alert. So you publish it with a given name, and then that will make it available to make dashboards around, etc. So then once you're done with the query, you don't want to unpublish it. You typically what you want to do is archive it. So archiving is similar to deleting, except if you have a direct link to the query, it's still preserved. So it basically makes it invisible, but it doesn't, it makes it so it doesn't break anything that's already in production. You can also copy a query by forking it, similar to what you do with Git. And then finally, you can export a query result, similar to what you can do in Databricks. Now, as far as query editing tools, you can get a Schema Browser by grabbing the handle on the side of the query editor. So if we look back, it's this handlebar right here. It's hidden, but that's how you would see the Schema Browser. And then you also get autocomplete on by default. If you click this little lightning bolt up here, that's what disables autocomplete. I personally find it very helpful, though. I have a tendency to make typos. And then finally, you can configure who can work with particular queries using the query permissions. So that's the query editor. Does that all make sense so far? Any questions? Okay. So next, I want to talk about dashboards. So this is what facilitates visualization. So again, this is just going to be the dashboard icon. So the tasks you can do with dashboards are either creating one. In this case, you're just naming a dashboard, collecting some visualizations up. It's fairly straightforward. I think the one thing that's kind of confusing is it's all widget based. So a widget can be a table, a chart, any type of visualization, but basically every component of a dashboard like this is going to be a widget. So once you're done, you can click Add to Dashboard, and then it's going to just be made available with that name and those widgets along with a refresh time for each widget. If you want to remove it, similar to with queries, you do it all through the ellipsis menu at the top right. If you need to edit it, then you can open up the dashboard and move everything around, again, similarly through the edit menu. If you need to add content, you can do it the same way. Another cool feature is filters. So being able to apply filters at the dashboard level should be familiar to anyone who uses Power BI. So essentially what you do is just apply a filter and then click use dashboard level filters, and it's going to apply your filters to all the underlying queries that support the particular visualizations on your dashboard. We've already talked about refreshing. You can just click the refresh button. They're all going to load quickly because they're fetching from Delta Cache. That's another Delta Engine feature. So if the query hasn't run recently, it might mix old data with new data. So that's why automatic query refreshes are valuable. Now, if you manually refresh or schedule a refresh, it's going to do that in the background. So you automatically refresh at these different cadences. It makes it a little confusing though, because if I click like I want it to refresh every hour and then I log out, it's not necessarily guaranteed to refresh. So if you want to guarantee that your queries are refreshed, you have to schedule the query refresh, not schedule a dashboard refresh, because those are coupled together. Finally, if you want to get this out to the public or to a member of your team, if you then anyone who's on your team that has the permissions to see your dashboards will be able to see it on the dashboard menu once it's published. If you want to take it back out of view, similar to a query, you can just archive it. To configure dashboard permissions, you can do it through dashboard access control. The access control menus, like we talked about earlier, are where you're able to manage all these types of permissions. Next, I want to talk about scheduling and alerts. So if you go back to the query editor menu down in the bottom left, you should be able to see a refresh schedule. By default, the schedule is never. If you click on that editor though, you'll see that you can go ahead and schedule a refresh on a particular cadence. You can also select a time for that refresh to end. So for instance, if there's a particular week that like a marketing campaign is running, right? Fresh results for the users of that dashboard during that week. You can set it to every minute and then set it to end in 7 days, for instance. So when you schedule queries to run at a certain time of day, keep in mind it does convert to UTC. This is the same way it works in Databricks. So if you want a query to run at a certain time in UTC, make sure to set a time zone in the picker. Another thing you can do with scheduled queries, similar to the Databricks Workspace, is scheduled query failure reports. So this makes it so that on an up to an hourly basis, you get emails on query failures. So this is sort of a roll up, almost like a newsletter of those query failures. The failure report runs on an independent process. So it may take up to an hour. You can, in the general settings for your Sql Analytics workspace, you can tweak that to either do it more or less frequently as needed. So if you think about scheduling queries, refreshing queries, and dashboards, how do you know when something interesting happens? That's what alerts do. So alerts make it so that you're notified when a scheduled query has a field that meets a certain threshold. So you can use alerts to monitor the business, integrate certain tools with, like I said earlier, Power Automate. Maybe it's a user onboarding or support ticketing workflow. Alerts make it so that scheduled queries are a little bit more valuable because their criteria is being checked after every execution of the query schedule. It's not strictly required for alerts, but think about it this way. If you add an alert to a non-scheduled query, you're only going to get alerted if someone goes in and runs it manually. Now, if you want a user to, like say an analyst or a member of your team to sort of be on the hook for that, and you can't necessarily automate it on a timeline basis, then, that's a perfectly valid approach. To view your different alerts, you just click on the alerts tab on the left. By default, your alerts are going to show up in reverse chronological order of when you created them. So your most recent will always be at the bottom. You can obviously reorder them by column, but every alert has a name, who created it, when it was last triggered, and when it was created. Within alerts, you can also have tasks. So if you want something to happen within an alert, this is where you set it. So we can go to the alert sidebar. We can make a new alert. We can pick a particular query in this drop-down box. And then this is how we set our thresholds. You pick a value column, and then you pick the threshold, and you can pick, just once, whatever your threshold you want, and then you can create that alert. So in the template dropdown, you get into a little bit more granular options. So you can pick this message basically. So like if you wanted to pass through variables or parameters to something like Power Automate, this is where you would do it. So you're essentially just encoding fields into that message. So it would look like alert name changed to alert status, right? And so you've got all these variables to play around with. And then finally, when you choose an alert destination, these are all webhooks. So it could go out to something like Slack, it could go to an email, it could go to Teams, or it can just go to an HTTP endpoint. So really the possibilities are endless there. If you're using, like I've been bringing up Power Automate, that's going to work very well with just using a generic webhook. So then, you can set up your notification frequency, like how often is this allowed to notify me? If you do just once, then it will say when it gets triggered and then when it goes back. It will not do it every time it triggers because it didn't change status. So that's alerts. I want to also call out, you have the ability to do an alert on multiple columns. What you would do is essentially just create a Boolean value within your SQL query. So I saw this earlier and I thought it was valuable to call out because that was my question too. Again, if you look at this interface over here in our dropdown, we can just choose one. But if you create an as statement, or a if then, and then just flag it as a Boolean, you can do as many columns as you want. So pretty flexible in that respect, because again, it's just SQL. Next, I want to just look at how to set up endpoints. So if you go into this link, or sorry, I think that was the wrong link. Where is it? There we go. So to view your SQL endpoints, you just click the endpoints button in the sidebar, similar to everything else. Like creating a cluster, you click new SQL endpoint. And then you get some pretty nice options here. Like I said, it's similar to a cluster, but it's different enough that I think it makes it a little bit easier for the types of users they're targeting. So you get a name, and then you get some t-shirt sizes for your cluster size. You can, similar to the Databricks Workspace, set up an auto stop, auto start threshold, like if you don't want it to run indefinitely. You can also do multi-cluster load balancing, which I think is really neat. So this is going to be very similar to what you've seen in Synapse Analytics, where it can automatically dump queries between different clusters, even different sizes of clusters, depending on the throughput of the endpoint. You can also turn on the experiment. This is their enhanced processing engine that's a part of Delta Engine. It's still in beta. So when you want to start it, you just go over to your endpoints icon again, click on the ellipsis and start your cluster. You can also edit it in that way. You can also add tagging. This makes it so that it's very easy to see what resources are consuming what on, for instance, Azure. So you can create key value pairs, and these get passed back through into the cloud resources. I believe they're even Azure native. So for cost management purposes, this is going to be huge, because you could say, no, it was that team that was spending all that, on the Azure bill last month. You can also turn on monitoring. So this lets you see, for instance, how many queries are running concurrently, if things are getting queued, how many clusters you're using, and this will help you manage the semantics around how to deploy your endpoint, if you need to scale it up or out, etc. By default, these are the t-shirt sizes. They're very similar to what you get in Databricks right now, or the Databricks Workspace. You don't get the choice to do particular types of, like, for instance, on Databricks Workspaces, you can pick between like your DSV3 or your LS. These are all just your e-cores. They are V3 though, so I think they're using SSD. And the default size is the E8 V3. So that's SQL endpoints. The final thing to talk about isn't really anything that I need to tell you about. I would encourage you to just go read about it. It's Delta Engine. So we talked about it a little bit earlier, what it can do, but just keep in mind that this is really revolutionizing the way Databricks is going to work because of the data lakehouse paradigm. They're pushing this really hard, and this is across industry. Microsoft is pushing this really hard with Synapse. Snowflake is trying to catch up to it as well. So really understanding how that works and how you can best work with it is going to be huge. And then I would encourage you to read a little bit about Photon as well. That's that vectorized purpose-built compute engine for SQL and data frame operations that I talked about at the beginning. But I don't want to belabor the point too much. You can go back and check out some of my discussions from the June Spark AI conference if you want to hear more details about that. So that is SQL Analytics. I know that was a lot, so I want to go ahead and end it there and open the floor up for questions, and then our standard office hours. So anyone have any questions so far? I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. All that making sense? Okay. Any questions not related to discussion today, just related to how you're using Databricks in general, or any data science or engineering thoughts? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm more than happy to just give everyone the time back.
I do actually have a question. It's it's not well thought out, but it is interesting to realize that things like Tableau and Power BI now have new connectivity.
Yeah.
New connectivity might change the way workflows work. And I was thinking about it last night that currently there's a lot of engineering work to set up data so that it can be consumed by Power BI. And that's a good official process.
Oh, I think I see where you're headed. Yeah.
So is this potentially going to help shortcut and maybe like advance the visualization initially, but potentially create more tech debt in the long run? Or is it an intermediate step that could be leveraged to then fill in how the engineering work could be done? It feels like a piece that gets put in between that may or may not be definitely use it.
I think if what they're saying about pricing is even close to true, I really think it is going to be monumental. So, like everyone tosses around the greatest thing since sliced bread idea, right? But like the more I think about it too, it really could be that way. Because if you think about what a lot of users do in Power BI, um, they're not necessarily writing stuff in Power Query M as much. There's still a lot of DAX being thrown around. Well, like really, most users I see out in the wild when they need to do their data munging for a Power BI or for a Tableau, they're doing it in SQL. And so they're hitting the database engine on the back end. If you are now hitting a Delta engine backed data lakehouse, then you're going to be even more encouraged to do less in your native Power BI tabular engine running on your silly little laptop when you can, in a cost efficient way, just have it run on this super cluster on the cloud. And so I think it's going to push even more stuff up into the cloud. And then when you think about it from a data, like a SQL DBA perspective, you're going to start saving those queries. You're going to start designing your endpoints around the common types of queries. Now, all of a sudden, instead of all these super critical log analytics being stored on a single Power BI report on a single person's computer and then being lost into the ether, you're going to be really able to drive your data engine towards the actual consumption patterns of the people consuming from it. So it could be pretty great. We'll see.
That's kind of what I was curious about because I could see it going both ways, but it's definitely an advancement over where we're currently at.
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean the tooling is certainly there. It's always a question of how people use it, but I'm certainly thrilled. One of the big things in the backlog for my project for Q3 is definitely going to be trying to pull over as much as we can back into the Databricks side because of the native connector and because of this anticipation for the SQL Analytics runtime. Because previously, like I knew that I could coerce my team to grin and bear it and do everything in Spark. But if you're feeding data out to like another vendor that wants to report on top of your data lake, they're not going to want to do that sometimes. Like maybe they just hired this guy off the street that knows SQL, right? And so being able to say like, don't you worry what's happening behind the scenes, just hit this endpoint and, you'll be fine, I think is going to be huge.
So another question related to that, do you think that this is a new path into Databricks usage? And what I mean by that is there's a lot of focus on Power BI.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody just wants to get a Power BI report. This offers a unique way to connect to data, and they may not have Databricks set up at all, but they really want to use this SQL Analytics because it solves a specific problem for them. Do you think that this might be a big enough motivation for that organization to go and develop their Databricks just so that they can use this?
I certainly would hope so. I'm going to pull up a screenshot real quick again. So, where is it? So, if you look at, for instance, where is it? I probably won't be able to find it in real time. I was just going to show what it looks like for a user that's just hopping into, for instance, a Databricks notebook versus someone hopping into the query editor in the SQL Analytics engine. And to me, it's a night and day difference. So essentially, like what the SQL Analytics environment is going to be able to do is almost like what the corn lobby did with corn syrup, right? Where you're like, oh yeah, I don't use corn syrup. And then you start checking and it's in your macaroni and cheese, it's in your soda, it's in, things that you don't even imagine it could ever make it into. I see situations where enterprises are able to unify their analytics platform to where they're doing it all on this massive Databricks workspace, and then they're just paring it down at the endpoint level for teams that maybe need notebook access versus just querying access, right? And because of the access and cost controls, you can make it so that you could have one workspace across an entire enterprise. And then it's just a matter of grouping them up and assigning permissions to people to determine what they're able to see and what they're able to get.
Perfect.
You
That
wouldn't
helps a lot.
even, yeah, you wouldn't even necessarily need to know you're using Databricks. Again, you just know that this is some SQL endpoint that some guy in IT gave you.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. That's probably true that it'll be used because it's an easy path to data, and the Power BI user might not even know what they're connecting to.
Yeah, and like that's the screenshot I was going to share. I can't find the one of a Databricks notebook I wanted to look at. But if you just tell them like, yeah, run this query, how would they even know what they're in? It's
Exactly.
just a select statement. It's just ANSI SQL. Whereas you're like, well, so technically you actually have to put single quotes around your as statements for a reason we can't quite explain. And by the way, limits go at the bottom, not at the top. Like there, if you look at the SQL usage guide that's in here versus where is it? Over here, the SQL reference for SQL Analytics versus the SQL reference for Spark SQL, clearly they learned their lesson in terms of trying to reinvent the wheel. Because if there's one thing data teams do not care to do, it's to relearn a different SQL syntax yet again. Reminds me all too much of the HiveQL stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, if there's no other questions, we will go ahead and leave it there. Again, thank you everyone for attending. We'll be figuring out what we're gonna do for December. We might just not do one. We'll see. The last Tuesday of the month is the 29th. So if we end up having it, I'll see you December 29th. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks, Lindsay. See everyone next month.